Good morning. Welcome to our roundtable discussion today on recreational marijuana legalization. My name is Rustyn Stoops. I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. I'm the Executive Director of Delaware Manufacturing Extension Partnership here at Delaware Technical Community College, and I also serve as co-chair of the Delaware Manufacturing Association. I'd like to welcome everyone here and also welcome our panelists who will get to meet here in just a moment. A little background into today. During our most recent DMA meetings, the topic of the legalization of marijuana has surfaced with much energy, and local manufacturers are trying to understand the impacts that this will have on their business and the safety of their employees. At this point in time, there's about 15 states already dealing with this legalized marijuana, and we thought this would be a good opportunity to learn from those who've already done this before. So I know there's mixed feelings out there about the philosophical question of legalization, but that's not our conversation today. Basically, our conversation today is when this happens, what do we need to do and how do we get ready for this for manufacturers? Last week, a bill to legalize marijuana was introduced, House Bill 150, and later this morning, the bill is scheduled for committee. So today's discussion is very relevant and timely. The chamber also last week released a position, and I'll read it here very briefly so that everyone is up to speed with this if they didn't have a chance to see it. The state chamber position on the legalization of recreational marijuana can be summed up this way. We respect the rights of the adults to do what they want, where and when it's appropriate. Employers, however, want to have the ability to preserve their own unique policies on this topic and prefer to wait for technology that provides a spot test for impairment and immunity from liability. Today, we encourage you to submit questions using the chat feature. I know you're all going to have some questions, so please feel free to introduce those. And actually, we encourage it because while we may not be able to get to all the questions today, knowing your questions will help guide future programming on this topic, because I think it's safe to say that today's roundtable is only the start of this conversation. So let's go ahead and let's meet our panelists. Thomas Sanford, an experienced business and financial professional. Thomas is a founder and partner in Four Pillars Investors and currently oversees two portfolio companies in the CEO role. Turk Manufacturing and EPSM are located in the Silicon Forest area surrounding Portland, Oregon. They manufacture metal components and electromechanical assemblies for the high-tech industry. Next, we have Mitch Magee making his virtual return back to Delaware. Mitch is an experienced engineering director, recently retired from PPG. He's worked for PPG over the last 35 years. Most recently, he worked with PPG Aerospace, providing mission-critical coatings, sealants, and transparencies to the commercial, military, and general aviation markets. Mitch has worked with Manufacturing 4.0 efforts while supporting engineering and capital projects for a global network of operations. Mitch is also an advisory board member for the National MEP Network. And finally, our third panelist for today is Anthony Macherone, Senior Scientist, Agilent Technologies, and visiting professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. For the past several years, Anthony has been leading a team of Agilent scientists for the development of analytical testing methodologies to assure quality and safety of cannabis products. Anthony has written extensively on cannabis testing methodologies, solving complex problems encountered when using certain analytical systems, and contributed several chapters to books on this subject. In June of 2020, Anthony joined Cannabis Science and Technologies Editorial Advisory Board. I'd like to welcome everybody here today, and thank you for taking the time to join. To kick things off here, I'm going to ask a pretty straightforward question. If you all could just answer that question and probably give us a little bit of background on your companies and your surrounding information to this answer. And that is, I'll start off here with you, Thomas, and then I'll move on to Mitch and Anthony. What is the current hiring policy within your organization around marijuana?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I'm in the unique position of running two companies, both of which we acquired from previous owners. And so the policies carry over from the first 20 years of the company. Marijuana was legalized in 2015 in Oregon. And so for the last few years, we have seen a lot of the different companies moving through and trying to figure out what to do with their hiring policies. For us, one of the two companies, Eagle Precision, doesn't currently have any policy in place for hiring, so there's no pre-screening. Though a lot of our employees come from temp agencies, which do screening, so there's some embedded in that. For post-hiring, we train our managers and people on the floor for reasonable suspicion, and so that's kind of how it's looked at after the hire. For the second company, Turk Manufacturing, our hiring policy there is a little bit more robust. We do a pre-employment screen, which tests for THC over the last 30 days. That's been in place for many, many years. And that's a 5-panel test, so not just for THC, but others as well. And then post-hiring, we do incorporate random testing there through a third party. And we also train for reasonable suspicion for managers and so forth.
Thank you, Thomas. Mitch, you want to try and tackle that question?
Yeah, maybe I just start a little bit, having worked for a large corporation. I think it's pretty typical of most major manufacturers that have had, ADI, alcohol, drug, and intoxicants policies for many decades. And then we think about that as alcohol is part of these processes. Alcohol is also part of these programs. And these programs are beyond testing, include things like education, awareness. For those individuals who do have problems, there's counseling, rehabilitation resources also available. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about is testing, and having worked in California for the last 2 years where marijuana is legalized, there are certainly some additional challenges. And similar to what Thomas, I think, just went through, is most large manufacturers, really 3 prongs to the testing program. There's pre-employment, there's probable cause where you have an issue in the workforce itself, and then random. And I know the challenges and we can talk a little bit more about that, is in California, as a federal contractor and under DOT regulations, we have requirements to have a drug-free workplace. And as a result of that, particularly for illicit drugs, is that we have a zero tolerance there in terms of pre-employment. So if there's a detectable level of those illicit drugs, and basically they're eliminated. And I can share too, is it I think California legalized it back in 2016. In our case, with the pre-employment part of it, there was an uptick a little bit when the legalization did occur in California, but we still, even at this today, is probably have experienced single-digit rejection rates, or failure rates, I should say, in terms of those pre-employments. But I know Anthony, and I think some of part of the other panelists, a lot of the big struggles, a lot of the big challenges we have are, what's acceptable levels, what are the proper test methods. We've just gone from, or I should say, PPG, I am a retiree, so I'm really speaking on behalf of myself, but PPG just made a change from hair follicle testing to urine testing, which really is a pretty big difference. But I know that I think all of us really do struggle with a lot of those questions.
Thank you, Mitch. Anthony, we'll let you go ahead and answer that question about the current policy, and maybe a little bit of the background around that policy.
Okay. So thank you very much. Agilent Technologies is a global life sciences and chemical analysis manufacturer. The instruments that people see in CSI and those types of programs on television. And we have a policy on, pre-employment policy, a policy on ongoing policy while people are employed with the company, basically zero tolerance. The manufacturing plant in Wilmington, for example, we possess a DEA license, a Schedule I controlled substance license. So we have, very strict policies around, having those types of materials on site. We have to have them on site. We have to test for things like fentanyl, for marijuana, for other things like that, as we work with our clinical or our forensic toxicology partners. And so we have to have those materials on site, but we have to treat them like controlled substances. So we really have a very strict policy on how we handle controlled substances within the organization. And of course, from the employment perspective and safety perspective of our employees, essentially zero tolerance.
Thank you, Anthony. So you've all indicated that you currently have pretty much a no in place for hiring. What about considerations for eliminating that guideline? Is that something that's in consideration for any of you?
Yeah, I can speak to Russia. I think that, again, there's regulations right now in terms of, or not so regulations, but contracts. If you do any kind of work with the federal government, and particularly in the defense industry, there's a requirement to have a drug-free workplace. And I don't see that as changing. And we'll talk a little bit later, I think, in the panel, is that, fundamentally, why do we have this? It's for safety reasons. And those of us who have operated chemical plants or facilities where you're dealing with some potentially hazardous materials or processes, you've got to have some assurance that the employees are, and really from the liability standpoint, assurances that we're operating as safely as we can.
Thanks, Mitch.
I think for us, our goal is to bring these two companies together. And so we have, again, a unique perspective of kind of taking two and combining them and trying to figure out what the best path is. And so looking at best practices, at least in Oregon, where it is legal and has been legal for 5 to 6 years, you have to ask yourself if your company should be philosophically a zero tolerance. It's okay to bifurcate kind of administrative versus production from a safety perspective. So legally speaking, working with our HR lawyers out here, we've determined that if we wanted to, we could say, well, the administrative staff, because it's not really a safety issue, maybe that's the path. But production, obviously, we have a general duty of safety as managers and owners. And so that's number one priority, is keeping everyone safe. We've determined kind of through conversations out here, some people are removing the random tests as they're an unnecessary cost. But again, it depends on what the company is. It's very, and to Mitch's point, if you have a federal government contract, they look at it a little bit differently still. But yeah.
Okay, well, I can't really speak to the future policy at Agilent. That's well above my pay grade, so to speak. But we have, our headquarters is in California, and so there's recreationally legal cannabis there, and we still have to treat that as a controlled substance on our site. I don't see that changing because of our affiliations with government contracts and and our DEA requirements. So I don't see anything really changing, but again, I can't really speak to future policy.
Thank you. We've mentioned several times now that much of the need for keeping marijuana off of the manufacturing site is in the concept of safety. And this is a real heavily discussed topic. What issues have you seen or experienced so far in the safety area?
Yeah, Rustyn, I'll start off. And as I mentioned before, is it really my experience has been in again, large manufacturers, you've got an ADI policy, and that includes alcohol. And the fact is alcohol has been and continues to be probably a bigger challenge, if you will, than marijuana. And it's unfortunate, but there are, as I mentioned before, probable cause. Under the DOT regulations, if you have an accident, there is a testing that occurs at that point in time. I think even in the California area where we have the reasonable belief or probable cause testing, at this point, even with the legalization, and I think the alcohol issue still far outweighs the marijuana challenges, although it is grown, even though it's a small number and it's a small issue.
Yeah, and I agree. I can kind of echo that. I think with alcohol, it's a little bit easier to identify via smell and just other aspects of it. There are so many different ways to administer marijuana at this point, and so many of them have no smell or other kind of identifiable pieces to them that it makes it very difficult to accuse someone of using or not using that versus something where you might be able to smell it or some of those other pieces. So I would echo Mitch and say for us, alcohol is a more prevalent and identifiable piece of safety issues that we see. And from a marijuana standpoint, because of the difficulty in identifying a user, we have never seen a safety issue, which is lucky. But to the extent that people are using on the job, different people, it could be a lot of people using and just they manage it well and you can't tell, or it could be zero and we don't know. But we haven't seen any safety issues because of it, which is good, obviously.
Thank you, Thomas. So kind of we'll come over to you now, Anthony, and build off of that because of your background's a little different. This topic of impairment or sobriety and detecting it seems to be a big area of interest. I've already been receiving some questions on that topic here. So could you touch on some of the ability to detect or quantify the definition of impairment? We're all familiar with the blood alcohol content for alcohol, but what is our options as far as marijuana?
Well, it is quite a bit more challenging. To my knowledge, as you know, there has not yet been a clear threshold defined for inebriation from marijuana, unlike what we have for alcohol. The psychoactive component of marijuana, the one that gives the feeling of euphoria, is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or more commonly referred to as THC. This is the compound within there that, as I mentioned, makes people feel high, and that's the one that is mostly concerned from field sobriety tests, those types of things. But there's a challenge with THC is that it has a very, very short half-life, so it doesn't stick around in the body that long. So within a few hours after ingesting, either through inhalation or through eating some type of marijuana product, you really can't detect that THC anymore. You can detect metabolites for quite a while, and it depends then on usage. A person who may be a very occasional marijuana user, you may be able to detect these metabolites, up to 3 days. And for a chronic user, maybe up to 30 days after they cease using the marijuana or the product. Then it shifts from, a kind of a spot test, on site after an accident. Can we identify inebriation to more of a laboratory-based test? And these, at that time, days, it may be after blood is drawn or something like that. It's very difficult to say, was that person inebriated at the time of the incident? Because now we're detecting metabolites, not necessarily the psychoactive drug. And that is what really makes it difficult and challenging for testing marijuana and products derived therefrom. And again, it's very unlike alcohol. Alcohol's pretty cut and dry. Once any person gets to about 0.08%, they're inebriated, and it's pretty easy to tell. And you could have a chronic user of marijuana that functions and you can never even notice any difference. So I think what's going to ultimately happen in many cases, if we kind of think about field sobriety or testing at the time of an incident, it's going to be more of a cognitive test. And again, this is my opinion, not necessarily that of Agilent, but the typical touch a nose, say the alphabet backwards, those kinds of things may be all that we really have for a while to really say, is this person impaired at the time of an incident?
What other challenges does the team see as impacting the manufacturing sector? I know we're dealing here with a situation whereas we're talking about legalize something within the states. This is not a federally legalized item, still a controlled substance. So we've already talked about contracts being in place, but what other factors can come into play for manufacturers, I guess, as secondary, not necessarily on their job sites, but can be factored into the way they're doing business?
I can start there. Is it, again, legalization will provide some administrative burdens. There's no question about that in terms of dealing with the legal compliance issues. And in California, it does. As much as we have, any manufacturer would have programs in place for pre-employment, probable cause, or random testing. There's clearly some challenges and compliance issues that need to be determined. Not the least of which are things that Anthony just talked about in terms of what's an acceptable level. And again, because of our federal contracts, because of the current state of knowledge within the industry, is zero is our target. It's a detectable level within whatever test method we use. But there clearly are some challenges there in terms of administrative burdens and costs associated with that.
We haven't seen too many outside of the scope of kind of what we've discussed here as a panel. We've discussed a little bit prior to this meeting the impacts on real estate, and in the states where it has become legalized, you've seen the companies either growing or storing marijuana to buy up and lease up a lot of the warehousing space. And so I know it's become an issue for others, but I'm with Mitch. I think administratively it just becomes the biggest burden as we try to fulfill our, like I said, the general sense or this general duty of safety. So for me, that's the biggest one. I don't see a lot of externalities that impact us as manufacturers outside of our four walls too much. So.
Okay. Times have changed, so has marijuana. Anthony, can you talk a little bit about today's marijuana versus maybe what we would call our parents' marijuana? Things have really changed as far as what's out there in the market and its characteristics.
Oh, absolutely. So contemporary marijuana is much, much more potent. And again, that's with respect to the delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol level, the THC level within the product. What we would see back in the 70s, early 80s even, were 1 to 2% by weight of this particular psychoactive compound in the marijuana. Now it's 20, 30%. And you can even buy concentrated materials, more refined materials that may have 80, even 90% of THC in them. So very, very, very potent compared to what we had many years ago, decades ago. So there's been a big change there. And just to address some of the challenges I think that, states may be seeing, all of this from the federal perspective is illegal. Marijuana is a controlled substance in the United States of America, right? The DEA controls that. The states have used their own legislative powers to legalize either medicinal or recreational programs within their borders. And that's a very important thing too. And what we might run into in terms of regulation, trying to transport this very potent material from California to Nevada or into Delaware from California, that's a big no-no. That's federal trafficking. So what happens within your state, what's grown in your state, the products within your state must be tested and distributed within that state. And again, it's up to your legislation to define what those products will be, how potent. Some places have limits on potency. Some places don't allow, like Texas, for example, doesn't allow THC at all. It can have a diol type product that's allowed. So these things kind of have to be worked out, and again, really add to the challenges. But getting back to your question, this is far more powerful with respect to THC than it was back in Cheech and Chong's time, let's say.
Based on your experiences dealing with implementing it in your states and the research you've done, are there any lessons learned or best practices that you would want to share with Delaware in hopes of, if this does move forward, that it set up in the best way possible for manufacturers or employers in general?
I think for me, I would recommend looking at the type of company that you are, and how do you fulfill your duty to the safety of everyone there. And if it becomes legalized, know that there will be challenges, but it's been going on for many years now in many states. And so I think there's resources to at least help understand all of those. though because of some of the issues that Anthony has talked about today with spot testing, there may not be as cut and dry answers as maybe with alcohol, but there are a lot of resources out there to dig through to help formulate an informed opinion.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. Is we've got to nail down some of the details before we move forward. And I use, again, California as an example. If you talk to those in the industry itself, their biggest challenge is in California, the taxes, the administrative burdens to be able to grow, and the supply chain is so burdensome that, frankly, the illegal market has actually increased. And there's a real challenge there within the California market with a lot of the illicit products having, frankly, from a public health standpoint, a lot of contamination with fungicides, rodenticides, things that, that unfortunately the illegal markets don't pay attention to. So it's a real challenge in California where the demand has grown, and unfortunately the illegal market has grown as a response to that, even perhaps more than the legal market. And it's creating some real challenges from a manufacturing standpoint. I know, Rustyn, we talked earlier, I can't say that it has had a big impact on either employment or, in terms of warehousing spaces, that impacts manufacturers per se. It is a business opportunity. And I know if we talk to, and I think that's a recommendation, is talk to those people who are actually running that business and the challenges they see in California, because again, the administrative burden the state of California has put on them has created some incentives that have really empowered the illegal market. From a manufacturing standpoint, again, I think the reality is if we're, multinational companies are still going to have to comply with federal law. The challenges that we have, any manufacturer going to have with dealing with those details, which have got to be figured out. As Anthony mentioned, is the alcohol is pretty well defined. What's an acceptable level? Where is somebody impaired? Because that's what we want. We want a safe work environment, and defining what those acceptable levels are got to be figured out before we start going willy-nilly here with legalization.
Yes, and you touched upon something very important there, Mitch. The testing of the products themselves, ensuring that those products that are distributed legally within a state are safe. And that really requires, a good amount of chemical testing and biological testing to ensure that things like heavy metals, lead, cadmium, mercury, arsenic, pesticides are the ones that are being used are the ones that have been accepted, and those levels don't exceed what's defined by that state. Certainly the potency must be in every product. You have to determine that potency and ensure that that's within the limits that are defined by the state or within the product itself. So chemical testing, biological testing for things like E. coli, aspergillus. There's been some unfortunate incidents, I think even in California with aspergillus, which is one of those species is quite toxic, getting into a product, and that could be a very serious health concern. So from the testing perspective, and that's what I do, we really need to do this well, and we need to start working with our neighbor states across the country, wherever these programs are being legalized, to harmonize the way that we're going to do this testing. So we're ensuring safety, we're doing the tests similarly, we have similar outcomes from that testing.
Were there any unique occurrences in Oregon, Thomas, that stand out from what was already said, or?
Nothing that I can think of.
Okay. We have room for questions in our timetable. If anybody has any, please submit them. Got a great crew here. Love to share information with you.
I think I've seen a couple of those, Russ, and I'll jump on a couple of them. I know there's one,
okay,
which the question is currently right now is if an individual, even in a legal state, and this is what you struggle with even personally, even from a manufacturer standpoint, is again, we want workforce development is frankly a much more important issue than legalization of marijuana. But if I get an employee in the state of California who does use recreational marijuana, comes to work, And the current state of affairs is if there is any detectable levels of those metabolites, as Anthony had just mentioned, they are then put into a program. And that's usually, again, you go through counseling, rehabilitation, and more frequent testing. And if they fail, there's a termination. In the cases of medical marijuana, I think the medical marijuana, not unlike any other medical condition or drug that is used, is that if it impairs that individual's ability to be able to do that job, those individuals, there are dispensations, and again, this is why I say legalization of marijuana is really a big. It's going to require a lot of HR resources to be able to figure a lot of these things out. But medical marijuana, not unlike any other medical, legal drug that's prescribed to someone, if that impairs that individual's ability to be able to do that work, they cannot do that job. Now, most companies attempt to try to do accommodations to those individuals, but if they can't accommodate that person, that individual probably is going to be laid off, or and again, I'm not an HR professional, but there's avenues that they have to pursue, because at the end of the day, most companies are not going to put somebody in a position where there's a legal drug or not a legal drug if there is any sense of potential impairment.
Yeah, to echo Mitch's commentary there on the medical, because I think that is a big question. You're not legally required to accommodate it. And so again, it goes back to kind of a judgment and do you want to bifurcate to administrative versus production or not? And but it all goes back to safety. That's the number one. So.
Yeah, I think I did see a question there in terms of with legalization. I think that, and again, what I've seen of it is it has increased usage. It has increased usage with all sectors from all age groups. And it does also result in problematic usage as defined by the medical profession. So that's a challenge. And one that, again, I think we're all recognizing it, long term, this is probably an inevitability. The question is, as you, I think, posed it initially, Rustyn, is how to deal with this and hopefully have some impact on the process so that we have well-defined criteria, well-defined test methods, and those are the things that need to be really, I think, focused in on.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of questions on this idea of taking medical marijuana, as you touched on already, Mitch, and those kind of things. But I did see another one come up here. It kind of takes in a different avenue, and that is, would manufacturers or businesses not consider moving to or expanding in a state with legalized marijuana? We see this happen with organized labor and these kind of things going on in discussions of whether it's a variable or not a variable. Have you seen anything that would indicate that a state with legalized marijuana is a variable in a decision on where to locate a manufacturing facility?
For us specifically, obviously, we acquired 2 companies in a state with legalized marijuana. It isn't a consideration for us. It's not a big enough issue. There are the issues that we've described today surrounding the difficulties in administering it, but none of them have been big enough to stop us from growing or looking at acquisitions in those states. So.
And my sense is that I don't know that it's at this point in time on anybody's radar screen in terms of sourcing or citing any kind of expansion or contraction of a manufacturing site. You look at, again, California, which is one of the biggest centers of defense industry. The Grumman, Northrop Grumman's, those corporations have very strict policies also. And again, through my experience at the company I work for, is that people, I think, recognize and they realize that even though it's maybe illegal in that state, if I want to work for this company, I'm going to have to be clean, and that's just a fact of life. And so it's, I think most of those companies and most of the employees have adapted to that environment.
We talked about the idea of testing and ways of controlling quality and those kind of things. But I guess maybe we can ask this question in general. Do you see this having an impact on business in Delaware in support of marijuana, such as testing labs, such as other materials for the growing and cultivating. What do you see this, or have you experienced maybe in your states in support of the marijuana industry?
Maybe I can start there quick. Certainly, where we've seen, states like California, Florida, Nevada, the ones that Oregon, where they have recreationally legal cannabis, there's certainly a great opportunity for laboratory new businesses to get into that testing market for manufacturing of various products. So there's great business opportunity for those types of things in a state that has legalized, especially recreational marijuana. So yeah.
I think, as I mentioned, is that California, I think the last number I've seen is like a $3 billion business. And, I've had some personal experience with those individuals who work in that industry. And as I mentioned before, I think, again, their biggest challenge right now is the illegal market that has also grown actually proportionally larger than the legal market. And I think, again, there's lessons there to be learned and to apply that to any other state that's considering legalization.
If I may just follow up on that, the growth of the illegal market kind of commensurate with the legalization, I think that really points to the fact that what needs to happen in terms of the testing within the state is we need to develop quick, accurate, cheap, and effective testing methodologies, so we're not adding that huge cost to the product. In California, if I recall correctly, a couple of years ago, to get the full suite of analytical testing for a specific product was around $1,000. So that really adds a lot to the cost, and I think that made it challenging for the legal market to compete with the illegal market. Of course, tax burden and all of that I can't speak to, but I do know that competition, effective testing, these are the ways that we can lower some of those costs and hopefully drive out the illegal component of this.
I know we kind of touched on this before, but I see the questions returning here. Just to clarify, how close are we realistic to determining if an employee is impaired having a test other than the touch your nose ABC test? Is there anything out there? Is there anything that you see as reasonable in that future? I know, Anthony, you've done some research over the years into quantifying what impairment is, so maybe we can clarify around some of that activity.
So there are some, kind of spot tests that are available, field sobriety tests, similar to what you had for blood alcohol, where you blow into the device for 30 seconds and it will measure specifically THC. But as I mentioned earlier, it's looking for that psychoactive component, THC, and that doesn't stick around very long. So if someone ingests marijuana in the morning and gets into a car accident in the afternoon, you may not necessarily find them positive for THC, and they may not necessarily be inebriated at that time. So that's kind of the reality of this. But yes, if you had someone who very acutely, smoked marijuana within a few hours, and then an incident occurred, and you had one of these tests, you could find them positive at that time. So those things do exist. It's just that they're for a very short window around the ingestion of the product.
And maybe just to follow up on that is again, current state right now with the current technologies, using the understanding we have, all we're looking for as a manufacturer would be detectable levels. And again, trying to define what is an acceptable level still is a TBD. That again, there's opportunities for some, I think, research and some studies that really need to be done before you jump into this.
Okay. If we weren't able to answer your questions here today, they come up, please reach out to the chamber. I'm sure they'd love to hear what your questions are so that we can include that in our programming for the future. Just a few closing remarks here. We do plan on holding some larger events on this topic in the coming months. We're asking businesses from states where recreational marijuana is legal and about their experiences since legalization, as well as law enforcement officials and social services providers for their perspectives. We'll also plan to include companies that are in the business or support of legal marijuana industry. There is a great page that was put together here. If you look to the left of your screen, there is a tab over there called Marijuana Policy. Take a look at it. There's quite a few good resources that are posted out there on this topic. And I'd like to have special thanks to our panelists here today for joining us, taking the time out of their schedules, and also to you, everyone in attendance, for taking time to join us on this conversation today. Thank you, everyone.